Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to give the audience just a minute to log into the webinar, and then we'll get started. All right, let's get going. So thank you so much for joining the Stimson Center today for a webinar to explore China's gray zone strategy toward Taiwan. I'm Pam Kennedy, the Deputy Director of the China Program, and I'm so glad to be joined by two of my Stimson colleagues. Dr. Kelly Grieco is a Senior Fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program, and James Siebens is a Fellow with the Strategic Foresight Hub. And each of us studies Taiwan from some different angles, and Kelly and I both separately visited Taiwan for research this year. So we have, I think, a lot of fresh insights to share on the topic of the gray zone. And James wrote a whole book on the subject, China's use of armed coercion to win without fighting. So he's also highly qualified to join our discussion. Today, we're going to discuss what China's gray zone strategy towards Taiwan looks like today. What is the range of activities? What impact does it have on Taiwan's defense capabilities and morale? There's no doubt, I think, that China's gray zone activities have intensified and increased in recent years, but what is the point? What is China trying to achieve via the gray zone, and how can we tell whether it's working? How is Taiwan responding and pushing back? So for today's discussion, I'm going to start us off by exploring the psychological side of the gray zone, as well as a bit on the economic coercion. And then I'll invite Kelly and James to walk us through the more complex military and paramilitary activities and impacts. And then in the latter half of the hour, we do want to take some of the audience questions as well. So please drop your questions in the Q&A box as we go. So I want to note to start that we can categorize much of our discussion today as cognitive warfare in the gray zone. So actions below the threshold of war, but that are malignant, have some sort of non-peaceful intention or goal behind them. And we're dividing the discussion into several big areas of the gray zone. So psychological warfare. In Taiwan, online forums and social media platforms have been a really ripe environment for these activities. China's ability to use the internet to disseminate information and attempt to shape narratives in the public discourse is, of course, very well documented. China's propaganda department has used internet commentators to spread disinformation or flood web pages with comments for decades now. The 50 Cent Army is, I think, as many of you know, a really good example. They copy and paste propaganda into comment sections of online articles or forums. And today, operatives have a greater variety or more effective tools to accomplish all of this. They can achieve a greater volume of posts by using fake accounts and bots. They can create more varied and convincing content on a given theme by using generative AI. And in the past, one of the tells of a disinformation post would be vocabulary, more commonly used in China than in Taiwan. Now operatives can use AI to quickly produce text in traditional characters that sound more like how Taiwanese type. And they can also use AI to create deep fakes, including images and videos of Taiwanese celebrities, politicians, espousing pro-China narratives of various kinds. So over the past year or so, the rapid improvement in AI's capabilities and China's development of its own AI, of course, DeepSeek, has greatly facilitated this ability of disinformation operatives to work within Taiwan's internet space. So who is affected by this psychological warfare? Well, there are 24 million people in Taiwan. and 22 million of them use the internet, which means that if they're online, they probably see ad content, even if they don't use social media. So everyone can be affected by this disinformation, whether or not they're old enough to vote. And for younger Taiwanese, it is interesting. If they've been in school in the past decade, they probably have had some media literacy training, but because they're still forming their own political identity and are still learning about the history of the cross-strait relationship, I think there's an additional risk there that the disinformation could affect how these young people view their political system, especially how they view China. So whereas older generations might not have as much media literacy training, they do tend to have a more entrenched worldview. I'll briefly touch on economic course of activities, and we'll come back to more of this later as well. These can include carrots and sticks, of course, like carrots like incentives to work and travel in China, but the gray zone really is about the sticks. So there's the well-known import-export bans. China repeatedly picks agricultural products like fruit or fish to ban, which directly hurts Taiwanese farmers. It's a way to punish Taiwan with immediate and highly visible effects. It's performative, since even though agriculture is a very small part of Taiwan's economy, it creates political pressure on the Taiwanese government. I think the most recent example would be the 2023 mango ban, in which China claimed that there were pests in the Taiwanese mangoes and stopped importing them. But it was really connected to then Vice President William Lai's transit through the United States the week before the ban. And then, of course, imposing tariffs is another option. And I think the biggest economic course of stick China might be holding in reserve would be the ability to impose a blockade and prevent importing and exporting goods, which we can discuss later. I think that something important to remember is that amid the psychological warfare operations, Taiwan's domestic political environment is a relatively easy target. There are pronounced cleavages in Taiwan's politics, particularly between political parties and identities. There's the ruling DPP, then the main opposition party, the KMT, its smaller and vital opposition coalition partner, the TPP, and then a large number of independent voters, around 38% of the population as of this past June. And then there's a smattering of smaller political parties as well. And the current government is divided. The president, William Lai of the DPP, won the January 2024 election with a plurality of votes, 40%. And the KMT, likewise, won a plurality of seats in the legislature, but can't reach a majority without the help of the TPP. So for the past year and a half, the government has been totally gridlocked. In February of this year, I'm sure you all know that there was a mass recall campaign that began against 31 KMT legislators with various rationales for the recalls, but many of them involving accusations of legislators being pro-China. And then this summer, in July and August, in 2 recall rounds, every single campaign failed. And then both sides claimed victory. The KMT claimed victory because their legislators had survived the recalls. And then the DPP claimed sort of victory because it was a peaceful exercise of a political process. But this great recall journey, which lasted from February to August, was filled with vitriolic rhetoric between both sides. And I think it absolutely was exacerbated by disinformation online relating to voting processes and procedures, like saying there was vote tampering going on, deep fakes of politicians. And it's really difficult to attribute this kind of different disinformation in part or in whole to China. But we do know that this kind of environment is particularly easy to exploit, and that it is in China's favor for people in Taiwan to be dissatisfied and frustrated with their political system. So the goal, I think, of China's psychological warfare efforts is to make progress towards unification with Taiwan by using the operations to deepen divisions within Taiwan society increase distrust of the government and political institutions, and cultivate a political environment in Taiwan that is more favorable to unification, whether because there's more pro-China sentiment or more anti-Taiwan sentiment. We can discuss more about whether this is a realistic goal and whether China is making any progress. I think there is pretty clear evidence that there hasn't been an impact on how Taiwanese think about themselves. We have 30 years of data from election study center surveys showing clear trends that fewer people in Taiwan every year identify as Chinese, and a growing number of people see themselves as only Taiwanese. And of course, a plurality of Taiwanese want to maintain the status quo in the Taiwan Strait indefinitely. But if we entertain the possibility that the gray zone strategy is a long game, say a 10 or 20-year time horizon, then I think we will need to watch how those identities change as the younger generations become more politically active. We know the younger people in Taiwan tend to see themselves as Taiwanese because it's the only political system that they have ever known, the democracy of Taiwan. So does that mean they will spurn China because of the threatening gray zone activities, or if China can be more subtle in the gray zone, tone down the military intimidation, is it possible younger people might not see China as an immediate threat? So I've been talking too long. Speaking of military intimidation, James, could you tell us more about what Taiwan is doing in this area?
Of course. Thanks very much, Pam. I think that was an excellent summary of kind of the problem set and also the strategic objective behind this approach. You mentioned the impact that these kinds of operations might have on Taiwan domestic political discourse, and I think that is very much the target. And want to just offer that it doesn't necessarily intend to shape Taiwan's perceptions about their identity so much as their perceptions of their strategic position and the options that they have in front of them with regard to managing their relations across the Taiwan Strait. I'll circle back to that in a moment, but you mentioned, for example, the campaign of cyber intrusions and related information operations as one of the main vectors that China approaches interference in Taiwan affairs. That's sometimes misinformation, disinformation, false narratives. But a lot of times, as we've seen in our own experience here in the United States, that kind of information campaign manifests as just amplifying messages that are already present in the mainstream media or in kind of Taiwan's domestic debate. They are just helping to raise awareness about certain perspectives, certain analyses that China sees as either discouraging Taiwan from pursuing a more kind of aggressive unilateralist path, or reminding Taiwan that it is vulnerable to other kind of more escalatory measures that the PRC might undertake. And so to that vein, or in that vein, you mentioned the study that we did, I should say, on China's use of armed coercion. And you and I co-authored a chapter focusing on Taiwan's experience there. What we tried to do in that study was basically try to understand how China has employed its military and paramilitary forces vis-a-vis other neighbors, and try to understand what the motivations behind these different operations were. And then also, the specific foreign policy objectives where there were specific foreign policy objectives, but also understanding whether the PRC is attempting to change the other actors' behavior through compellence, or if they're simply aiming to deter something that they don't want to see happen. And I think in this instance, it's both, but the primary emphasis is on deterrence. That China's narrative is that Taiwan and all of the territories under the control of the Republic of China are China's territories. And therefore, in their framing, they have a kind of it's theirs to lose, let's say, kind of framing. And what they want to do is to deter Taiwan's leadership from taking steps that would create greater distance between Taipei and Beijing, let's say, and Taiwan society and mainland society. And they want to deter outside powers, especially the United States, from lending the kinds of support to Taiwan that they think would encourage separatism, quote unquote. Okay. So the PRC has stated its commitment to pursuing peaceful unification, but the peaceful means that Beijing employs includes tactics and operations that we would certainly consider coercive at a minimum and threatening in an international context. So besides this kind of cyber attacks and information operations, when China wants to get meaner, as you pointed out, they can impose economic sanctions and export-import restrictions. You mentioned the 2023 mango ban. Before that, there was a 2021 ban on pineapples that was also seemingly politically motivated, although the PRC always kind of denies that there's a political motivation behind these things. It's a safety inspection, as you mentioned in the mango case, and I think that was also the case with regard to the pineapples. But if we think about the effect that trade barriers against U.S. farmers has in our own politics, it's clear to see that farmers are adversely impacted pretty quickly within a season by losing access to their main export market. And so that can create a political crisis, especially in a body politic that might have urban-rural divides already in place. And also politics that require kind of performance legitimacy as a means of maintaining support for the government. Now, one of the other things that we've seen is an increase in China's presence and regular patrols around Taiwan territories. And that's not just in terms of military exercises for demonstrative purposes, although we can talk a little bit about that, but we're also seeing more regular kind of Coast Guard patrols, more administrative assertions of administrative control and rights to control and exercise jurisdiction in those waters. So they might harass Taiwanese fishermen, for example, or commercial shipping, or they might protect mainland fishermen who are operating in Taiwan administered waters, for example. So I want to be clear that this is something that has dialed up in the last 2 years. So especially since the start of 2024, the Coast Guard, China's Coast Guard, has been increasingly patrolling around Taiwan, and the Coast Guard had participated for the first time in major military exercises around Taiwan last year, which is potentially significant because in terms of how the operations seem to be formulated, there's this idea of an inner kind of quarantine where people's maritime militia vessels and Coast Guard vessels form a kind of inner layer around Taiwan, and then that outer layer is supported by the PLAN, the Navy. And so that creates a kind of a indication of a division of labor that they imagine exercising administrative control and having the Coast Guard play a leading role in that kind of quarantine operation. And that's another thing that I'll come back to in a moment. So last year in February, there was an incident where Chinese fishermen drowned actually while they were fleeing from Taiwan Coast Guard vessels. And that's because they were operating inside Taiwan-controlled waters. But since that time, especially, the China Coast Guard has increased its patrols around places closer to mainland China, like Kinmen and Matsu Islands. And so some are worried that a clear kind of opening move in a coercive campaign or a more coercive campaign would be for China to essentially cut off Taiwan's access to those islands that are closer to the mainland and are more easily susceptible to Coast Guard control. Just a few weeks ago, actually, Taiwan Coast Guard was chasing China Coast Guard vessels out of the waters around the Kinmen Islands. And so there is a very clear and present friction around Coast Guard patrols and who's exercising effective control and jurisdiction in those waters. I'll also note that China has held very large and sophisticated military exercises like Straight Thunder to demonstrate its ability to control access to the main island, but also to control the main island's access to its outlying territories. And then another feature of kind of gray zone intimidation and threat that's worth noting is the severing of undersea cables. So earlier this year, actually, Taiwan reported that it had tracked a Chinese cargo vessel that it accused of cutting undersea cables. And then in February, there was another such incident. So these are apparently not isolated incidents, but rather another piece of the PRC's repertoire of gray zone coercion, where they're demonstrating their ability to cut off Taiwan's communications with the outside world in a practical way. Earlier this year, Taiwan launched a new program called the Regional Response Platform for Submarine Cable Security that's intended to improve their ability to track, monitor, and respond to these kinds of attacks. But the primary goal behind these kinds of operations, I would think, is psychological, right? Again, it's intended to remind Taiwan's leaders, and in some cases, U.S. leaders, that the PRC can indeed impose costs on Taiwan, can restrict its access to the outside world, both physically and digitally, and it can make things harder for Taiwan, preventing it from accessing its own territories or reinforcing its positions in the event of a conflict. And then in the extreme, it could impose a full blockade on Taiwan. Now, this is obviously intended to affect public opinion, but it's also intended to affect the calculations of Taiwan's leaders when thinking about how confrontational they're willing to get vis-a-vis mainland China. I'll also say that these operations that I've just described and that you described earlier are all consistent with what are described in China's Science of Military Strategy as primary methods of coercion, right? So things that the PRC is already doing, we would certainly describe as coercive. I'll leave my remarks there for now. Thanks, Pam.
Thanks so much, James. I think you bring up a really good point about not only exercising the ability to show off China's military might, but to exercise the administrative jurisdiction around Taiwan, essentially treating Taiwan like it is already well, as China would say, like an internal affair. So the Taiwan Strait as internal waters, which we also see in China's approach in some of the other areas in its near waters, like the Yellow Sea and the South China Sea as well, exerting administrative control rather than just military. To touch on more of what you've mentioned about also sort of demonstrating China's superior sort of power over Taiwan. I think that Kelly can shed some additional light on this. Kelly, you wrote recently about the very complex problem that Taiwan faces in like how to spend its defense budget to best defend against China in a future contingency scenario. And how often the decisions that the Ministry of National Defense makes are not going to be as effective as Taiwan might hope. And so what I'm really curious about is what effect the gray zone activities that you see have on Taiwan's defense readiness. Like, what is the cost of always having to respond to scrambles of jets around the island or PLA Navy vessels in the Taiwan Strait, and even on the law enforcement side, having to send out more Taiwan Coast Guard vessels when the CCG is active in waters around Lake Kinmen and Matsu. What do you think about that?
Great. Well, first of all, Pam, thank you for Into the China program as well to hosting today's event. Great discussion so far, and I'm excited to share some of my insights from my visit. I was there at the end of June and July, right before the big annual exercises in Taiwan, and conducted a series of interviews with officials and also, defense experts from Taiwan's community of national security community. So I'd like to just make 3 points to get sort of at the questions you're asking, sort of about its military readiness and then how this intersects with the gray zone. So, I think one of the things that really came across in my visit was that there's a lot of emphasis more on performance over preparation. And I'll just give some examples of this and explain how I think this interacts with the gray zone. So, interviewees that we spoke with very often would compare Taiwan's need for self-defense to Ukraine or Israel. But when you look at sort of what they're doing with their reserves and with civil defense, it falls short of those examples in significant ways. So, for example, Taiwan right now has reserves of about 1.66 million. That are meant to support an active duty force of 153,000. But in practice, the reserves are much smaller and less capable than what they look like on paper. And to illustrate this, one retired Army general told us that he thought that there were probably only about 250,000 rifles that could equip the reserves. So, that's quite concerning. And a lot of emphasis repeatedly in the interviewees on poor training of the reserves. This is something that Taiwan is trying to work on, to be fair, but they've emphasized that there's a lack of trainers to do this, and also the kinds of equipment, ready access to equipment to be able to sort of do this sort of high-end, very realistic training. The other part of this is it's also really challenging for them to mobilize. Another retired Army general told us that he thought it would take 60 to 90 days to mobilize the reserves. And this makes more sense when you realize that they actually still use a paper system to mobilize reserves. So, you might expect you're in Taiwan that they'd have some kind of digital system. You get a notification to say as a reserve, you need to report. No, they actually use a system that I think of as like World War II almost, of that where papers are delivered to physical addresses, to say you need to mobilize. So this is a much more slower process. And I think the biggest thing here is that, military service is not very popular in Taiwan, and so even though they're trying to expand reserve training, extend the amount of time that people are in the reserves, what we're seeing, though, is that a lot of the people that are eligible for service end up taking educational deferments. I think it's worth saying that in recent polling that was done by INDSR, which is a government-affiliated Taiwanese think tank, 68% of those polled said that they were willing to fight to defend Taiwan. But I think what we don't know is how soft those numbers are. For example, if the United States did not offer immediate assistance in a high-end scenario, would those numbers sort of drop down? And young people in particular are far less willing, it seems, to perform military service than their elders. So that's, I think, concerning. And we see similar things with civil defense. This has been an area that President Lei has really focused on in terms of civilian resilience, which has some overlap, civil defense to gray zone issues. This is a big part of annual exercises this year. But what I heard repeatedly from people in the defense community was that this was literally all for show. And for the media, and as soon as the media is gone, nothing else happens. And I think this does relate to the gray zone in some ways, and that you could understand from Taiwan's perspective, given the psychological impact that Chinese gray zone activities are trying to have, that you would want to sort of do this, even if it's performance, to reassure the public. That you're able to deal with these threats, and also to send some kind of signals to China to say that, we are actually resilient. The problem is that, that ultimately, if this gets really tested, the concern would be that this would actually really collapse. Now, the second point I just want to make is around the state of equipment and procurement. And this has a lot of intersections, again, with the gray zone. In war, it's often the boring stuff that matters. It's logistics, it's stockpiles to be able to sustain a resistance. And I say that this is the area where I came away the most concerned in some respects from Taiwan. A lot of that just doesn't exist, is my sense from conversations. So, for example, it was emphasized repeatedly that artillery is very old. The artillery that they use in exercises is new artillery. And they do that in part because, they're concerned about there being accidents if they use the older artillery. But what it means is when they're doing exercises, they're using their newer artillery, using the best part of their stockpile. Also, a lot of concerns around whether they have enough munitions and also spare parts and maintenance. This is, of course, in particular, these maintenance and spare parts issues are made worse by the gray zone because they're often are responding to intercept, Chinese aircraft or meet the Chinese vessels to try to, get them to turn around. This, of course, is making a lot of wear and tear on the equipment, making that worse. But I think one of the real challenges here is that there's a reluctance to really confront this sort of problem of the issue of spare parts and maintenance. They have not, my understanding is they have not stockpiled and dispersed their stockpiles. Taiwan has these wonderful mountains that are great for their defense. But they have not really dispersed things in those mountains to stockpile it. And some of that is they're concerned about how their citizens would react to that. And so let me just speak briefly about where I think this plays out in terms of strategy choices. Strategy is ultimately about trade-offs and hard choices. And so when you talk to people in their defense community, they will bring up, they face these two threats, the immediate gray zone problem, and then this sort of higher end existential threats, whether invasion scenarios or blockade. And of course, Washington is much more concerned with these high end issues. One of the things, though, that I would just say is that this is often treated as though these two threats involve complete trade-offs, right? You need a more legacy platforms, high-end platforms to meet, for the gray zone threat. You need these sort of more asymmetric, dispersed posture for the conventional threat. And I think to some extent this is often overstated. So I'll just give an example. Taiwan's indigenous submarine that costs, on average, it's saying about 1.54 billion. For this submarine. I can't really think of a good gray zone use for that submarine. Not all of these legacy platforms are relevant to the gray zone. And I think it's partly that the gray zone is actually, I think often in the Ministry of Defense, you're hearing them make the case that this gray zone is really important, and it is, but I think it also reflects a cultural bias. It's a way for them to make an argument around legacy platforms, which is their preference. And then on the civil defense and societal resilience, which I mentioned earlier, those are relevant to gray zone scenarios or these high end scenarios. But that said, it is true there are trade-offs and choices here. I think if Taiwan continues to engage in these sort of tit for tat responses to these gray zone challenges, particularly these kinds of incursions, it's going to lead to exhaustion. It also could be smarter, I think, in some of its strategy choices and procurement decisions about how it responds to these. So maybe not responding to every single incursion, mixing it up a bit in terms of strategy, but also investing in more uncrewed systems for things like ISR and situational awareness, which are so important to the gray zone, but also to these higher end combat scenarios. So there's definitely ways that the gray zone intersects with this sort of military readiness and these high-end scenarios. But to some degree, this can be a bit overstated. But when there are trade-offs, Taiwan is going to have to make hard decisions because it needs to reconcile means and ends.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It's a really sobering perspective from your field work and the interviews you conducted in Taiwan that Taiwan really does face twin challenges with the gray zone threats and then the potential future threat of a contingency in the Taiwan Strait, like a real attack from China. And I think what is most interesting about what you offered there is that you said, like, if Taiwan is tested, will the resolve of the people collapse? And that's what the gray zone coercion is really aiming at, is trying to shake Taiwan's confidence, use up its resources as well, so that people doubt that they have enough to fight back with, both mentally as well as physically, the material that they need to fight. But it's so difficult to tell from data how much confidence that the Taiwanese people have in their ability to fight back. I think that over the years, surveys generally show that people are quite resilient. They view Taiwan as their island, their society, their government that they're going to fight to defend. And there are surveys that show that even young people will try to do their best, to do the most to defend their homeland. But there are so many other factors when we look at these surveys, like how conscious are the people answering the surveys of the fact that China is also watching the answers to these surveys? Are they taking into consideration how much knowledge do they have about Taiwan's readiness? Are they doing something on their own? Like if they're women and they haven't served the compulsory service, are they taking additional combat or first aid classes, which are becoming more and more popular across Taiwan? So I think that what makes it so difficult to assess is that there are so many different factors. And of course, the US is another one. Is the US going to show up? Does Taiwan trust the US to show up? And the policy of strategic ambiguity, or the strategic ambiguity approach, rather, in the US policy towards Taiwan makes that impossible to guess. James, you look like you had some thoughts to add.
I wanted to actually pick up on something that Kelly said about the kind of emphasis on gray zone and the emphasis on this kind of psychological aspect of morale being first and foremost, perhaps in preparation for conflict. One of the things that just anecdotally from my own open source research, one of the things that I came across multiple times was essentially China announcing that it was going to conduct exercise in the Taiwan Strait or near the Taiwan Strait, or making some kind of a patrol to harass Taiwan Coast Guard. And the response of the Taiwan media or government was to just deny that it ever happened. Just say, no, we didn't see any kind of exercise, nothing to be worried about here. And that will only get you so far, but it's clearly intended to contest and decrease the potential impact of China's psychological operations by simply diluting them with, don't worry about it, right? Or there was actually nothing. They're just trying to get us to be scared. Let's not be intimidated. But the risk there is that if you focus on simply denying the existence of a threat, you essentially push the PRC to make increasingly convincing forms of that threat until it can't be denied, right? Until it's something that people can see for themselves.
Yeah, can I just do a two-finger on that? Because I think that's a great example that James offers of an approach to take. And immediately, one of the things that stood out to me is I also visited Philippines right before I went to Taiwan, and there's a lot of discussion about the transparency initiative there. For those that are not familiar, one of the things the Philippines has done in its South China Sea disputes with China is it's been really publicizing all of these incidents. And, you know, we can discuss how effective that was. The takeaway from their community of defense experts was probably that it helped to really raise a domestic awareness of this issue, was not helpful into actually deterring China from engaging in these kinds of incidents. And so this is sort of the non-transparency initiative, I guess, in Taiwan. We have like sort of the two, extremes of this. What I would say, though, I just wanted to highlight is, on this issue of the Taiwanese public, and their ambivalence or indifference to sort of some of these things. I think there are two possibilities here, because I very often would ask people, on this trip, taxi drivers, shopkeepers, not that, it's a large sample set, but, just get their thoughts. And, I was taking away two things. There's two possibilities here. They did not seem particularly concerned about the high-end scenarios or about the China threat in general. And there's two possibilities here, right? One is that the Taiwanese understand the threat to their country better than the United States does. And we are wrong, right? And we are, maybe hyping up the threat more or perceive a greater threat than the reality. That's one possibility. The other, I think, is that there is a bit of the boiling frog happening here, which is that, every time China crosses some new threshold, it is a big deal, like when it crossed the median line for the first time. But very quickly, the people become accustomed to that change, right? And so each of these little increments, is the salami slicing, is a big deal in the moment, but each one is not so big. And so there's a tendency, perhaps, I think, in Taiwan, this would be my fear, that the threat actually has risen quite a bit, but that it's not really perceived by the public because each one is these small incremental changes. And the real danger here is that this could be really effective for China, not necessarily changing in Taiwanese political objectives, but certainly has a negative impact for its defense preparations, because there's not this sense of a need for urgency among the domestic public.
You raise a really, really good point there, Kelly. Something that I've seen, and I've been studying Taiwan since 2018 or so, and made my first trip in 2019. And a really interesting split between the two major political parties who, largely on domestic issues, there's not a lot of daylight between their platforms. The big difference is how they would approach China, but it's also in how they deal with the threat perception. Everyone in Taiwan generally agrees that China is a threat, but it's how much of a threat. So the DPP tends to emphasize like preparation for a contingency. They recently published a handbook with very detailed information on how to prepare for all sorts of disasters, ranging from natural disasters to an invasion. What to do if you have elderly family members, preparing a go bag, who should you contact? Don't believe information that the government has surrendered. But the KMT, on the other hand, who's currently the opposition, takes the view that this is just scaring people, that the threat is real, but if we scare people, then we're not only provoking China, but we're also going to make Taiwan more vulnerable to these activities. And this spectrum of response, like how much should Taiwan prepare and how, is a really complicated calculation. And so it's really interesting to me also that you bring up how the sort of non-transparency policy in some of these cases is, I wonder if that's the DPP trying to like figure out where the line is and like what information to provide so that they can be accused of just like needlessly raising anxiety in the public, when no, there is not an imminent invasion so far as we know. But also like not downplaying it and making sure that people do have the resources and the knowledge that they need to be prepared in the case of an emergency. I think that's a really difficult calculation to make. James, did you want to add something there?
Well, perhaps just a note on kind of China's calculus as well, right? Their idea of peaceful unification is somewhat dependent on the idea that Taiwan feels vulnerable and can therefore find these demonstrations genuinely threatening and therefore motivating, right? China is attempting to compel Taiwan to engage in negotiations over unification under and basically to come, what they would say, come back into the 92 consensus, where they were at least in agreement on the idea that they were all Chinese people and that from there they could negotiate whatever kind of arrangement. Taiwan has essentially put forward a two-state theory without changing its constitution or otherwise formally seceding. So that's kind of the dilemma. That's the state of the dilemma. China's narrative, or China's vantage, as I understand it, is that essentially Taiwan would feel more vulnerable and would be more willing to negotiate based on that kind of predicament if the United States weren't offering it all of the military reassurance that it offers it. And so that's why this issue of America's defense commitment to Taiwan is perhaps the salient issue in Taiwan's politics on this question. How confident can the Taiwan people be of an external security guarantee by the United States? So the idea that the United States will come in and defend them is a large part of the basis for public confidence in being willing to kind of stand up to China, defy the idea of needing to engage in negotiations, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a small panic every time the idea of U.S. defense commitment to Taiwan is brought into question, because that really chips at the pillar of Taiwan's confidence in its own security.
That's also a really good point. And I think I'll bring in one of the questions here. Rich Cronin, who's also former Stimson, our distinguished fellow, he asks whether Taiwan's Silicon Shield accounts for part of this complacency regarding military preparedness, including the low reserve forces, because the idea of the Silicon Shield is that because the United States depends upon Taiwan for so much of our advanced computer chip, imports, that the US would be willing to protect that supply, basically, by protecting Taiwan in the case of an attack, just secure the supply chain. And I think that is possibly part of the equation, but is it complacency, or is it just, is it sort of doing the math? And I do think that part of what is going to spike anxiety in Taiwan around the credibility of the US over the next few months, that has really done some damage since the beginning of the Trump administration, is just the US's insistence on bringing more semiconductor investment to the United States from Taiwan. That's how it's perceived in Taiwan, although there is such a large market for semiconductors that it's fair to question, like, whether we're taking slices of the pie, or is the pie getting bigger, especially with the AI boom and the increasing demand for these really advanced semiconductors. So I think that there is a legitimate concern in Taiwan about that, and whether that is reaffirming the US's view of Taiwan as this really key production site of semiconductors, or whether it's the US hedging its bets so that in an emergency, it wouldn't need to respond. I'm not sure. Kelly and James, what do you think about the idea? Is Taiwan complacent growing complacent in its views of the US, and how has that shifted over the past couple years?
You know, I see, my sense was in talking to people that there wasn't really a consensus around views of the United States. You know, even on the Silicon Shield, you know, one of the things that surprised me is how rarely it came up in my conversations without my initiating it and bringing it up as a factor, right? Like, you know, the Silicon Shield and what you're like, what role does that play? So it doesn't often independently in my conversations come up as something that was brought up to like, here's why you would need to intervene. Or why we have real, like, our strategic value. So I think that's just one thing to say. There was concern about, as you brought up, Pam, the investments in the United States eroding to whatever strategic leverage it did provide. The one thing I would say just on the issue of U.S. commitment is when I was talking to, these are mostly retired generals and admirals, they very rarely actually brought up U.S. intervention. They seemed quite pessimistic about the possibility of U.S. intervention. And I was really struck by one retired general who mentioned, he said, I don't believe the United States will intervene. And I said, why? And he said, because we have absolutely nothing in place to deconflict military activity. I said, I will believe that the United States is serious about possibly intervening when that exists. And so I thought that was really interesting that there's a sense, at least among, you know, senior levels, I think, that Taiwan really needs to rely on itself, or at least for extended period of time. I think there's a recognition in particular that if it's not able to provide a resistance for an extended period of time, the United States will not be then coming to the rescue, right? It will be an easy decision for the United States if Taiwan cannot resist for at least a period of time. So, you know, there was real concern, though, about the Trump administration, of course, and what the position was. You know, even having contacts with the administration, they were suggesting if they were having, you know, some difficulty getting in contact and things like that, or with whom they should be speaking. But you know, there seems to not be a real consensus around how much they can depend on the United States, and you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
We have a really good comment from Ian Roberts about that. He writes, I was reminded of what General Omar Bradley once said, amateurs talk about strategy, professionals talk about logistics. And Ian asks, this is being seen more and more in Ukraine. Do the Taiwanese generals get it? Kelly, it sounds like at least some of them do. They're thinking about the practicality of how the US would respond. And if there isn't that groundwork laid ahead of time of how do we respond in different kinds of contingencies, then the response is going to be ad hoc. James, do you have, Kelly, you first, and then James.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think one of the big concerns, though, is there clearly are people in Taiwan that understand this and are advocating really hard to try to move Taiwan in the direction of taking these kinds of preparations seriously and doing the required things. I would just say, though, that there seems to be significant resistance within the Ministry of Defense around doing these things. You know, there's some progress, but it's very slow. And so, you know, to the extent the Trump administration can influence Taiwanese policy, it's probably in putting pressure on the Taiwanese government, the Ministry of Defense, to make these kinds of changes, sort of, you know, empowering, if you will, in some sense, the voices of the dissenters, the reformers in Taiwan. And so I think that's the real challenge. Is I just came away with this notion that, like, the Ministry of Defense is sort of very, very slow and traditional. And so there's recognition of what needs to be done, but overcoming that organizational bureaucratic resistance is really tough.
James, would you like to?
I would just sort of affirm the analogy to Ukraine, at least in terms of its ability to mount some kind of effective resistance at the outset of a conflict being prerequisite to U.S. support or more meaningful U.S. intervention. And part of that is just from a practical standpoint, Taiwan would have to absorb whatever opening round the PRC might throw at them. The U.S. would not be able to shoot down all of the incoming missiles on their behalf. for example, or intercept all of the bomber flights, for example. So there's just a practical need for Taiwan to be able to defend itself at a minimum for the opening days of a conflict while the US got any kind of diplomatic or military countermeasures organized. So that's just a practical consideration that can't be wished away. The other analogy to Ukraine, perhaps, is this Silicon Shield, and we've heard the Trump administration talk about the desire to create some kind of organic U.S. interest in Ukraine that could kind of galvanize greater commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. So Taiwan is counting on the idea that the United States has an organic stake in continuing to be able to import high-end chips. Taiwan hasn't transferred the manufacturing of any of the highest end chips to the United States. And the capacity that they have already kind of invested in the US is quite limited still. So I think it's too early for them to be concerned about a shift or a loss of influence in that respect. But a danger that I'm conscious of is conflating the economic and technological codependency, let's say, between the US and Taiwan with a US commitment to any particular outcome of negotiations across the Taiwan Strait. Because as you know, the US position is that we would accept whatever arrangement is acceptable to both sides on of the Taiwan Strait. So if a future Taiwan government decided to negotiate with mainland China, the United States, at least currently, hasn't formed a basis for kind of resisting, preventing, objecting to that negotiation. However, the US would still have a clear interest in maintaining its trade relationship with Taiwan. So let's say one thing doesn't equate to the other. The US economic interdependence with Taiwan does not equate to political and defense commitment to Taiwan necessarily.
So as we come to the last few minutes, I think it would be good to wrap up with what are the most important indicators that we are each watching from our different views of the gray zone threats towards Taiwan from China. What are you monitoring over the next few years in the short term to assess how the gray zone threat is evolving? I guess I will start with the psychological warfare side, especially the online, the internet-based content, really watching to see how AI develops over the next few years and whether there's a possibility for AI tools to help combat disinformation online. I think that, of course, the US has a really important role to play here as the home of much AI research and development, and also the tech giants that are spearheading some of these initiatives and own many of these social media platforms. There's a real responsibility for them to come up with some solutions for the very real dangers posed by disinformation campaigns, the ability of foreign actors or malign actors to interfere in domestic politics, including in Taiwan. James, Kelly, which of you would like to go next? James.
If I may, Kelly, I'm sorry, I've got the Zoom minimized, so I don't know if you were raising your hand at the same time. My brief response to your question is I am looking at whether or not any of China's kind of stated red lines are crossed. As you'll recall, a key issue for Beijing is any kind of official interactions between the government in Taipei and the government in Washington, D.C. Officials talking to officials equals official relations from Beijing's perspective. So we often kind of poo-poo that perspective, but I think it is important to be aware that that is the case and to not pretend otherwise and then act surprised when official interactions lead to official responses from Beijing in line with what it is threatening to do, which is increase pressure on Taiwan. The 2022 visit by then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, triggered a escalation that really has not come back down since. So in my view, those kinds of symbolic gestures of support that clearly, from Beijing's perspective, cross a line, may not be the best way to improve Taiwan's security. And as much as they might have a contribution to make to the kind of psychological and morale factor in this contest, they can also create a morale boost in Beijing for taking more assertive actions and to dialing up the pressure, to creating a kind of excuse for dialing up persistent pressure in ways that are very difficult to reverse. Now, the other thing that I'll say is that I'm attuned to more significant punitive operations, because one of the reasons I've been somewhat persuaded that Beijing does have a strong preference for peaceful approaches, right, which includes coercion, as I've explained earlier, is the fact that they haven't simply seized Taiping Island or seized the Kinmen and Matsu Islands. Those are very much within their grasp that would not require the kind of major military operation that I think forms one of the main concerns that's usually discussed in U.S. Defense scenario planning. Is this China attempting to mount a major amphibious assault on the main island and seize Taipei by force and to militarily occupy? That is a major operation. What isn't a major operation is a quarantine and invasion of Matsu, for example, right? So the fact that they haven't done that already means that they'd rather not. It doesn't mean that they cannot. What we should be conscious of is that they have that card available to them at any time. And if there were a significant enough violation from their standpoint of a red line, that's a big card that they would play or could play. So that's something that I'm kind of tuned into. And going down from there, obviously, is more of these kinds of attacks on undersea cables that would have the effect of cutting off communications with those locales or imposing greater kind of administrative quarantines to restrict any kind of trade between Taiwan-controlled islands. That would be a significant demonstration and warning from Beijing.
Thanks, James. Kelly, the last word goes to you.
Thank you. I think what I'm interested to see is, I think, James uses the phrase persistent pressure, which is what we're seeing with these gray zone activities, and particularly with the intensity of these joint combat patrols that China is doing near Taiwan into its airspace and territorial waters. It's going to be exhausting if Taiwan continues with the same tit for tat kind of strategy approach. So what I'm really want to see is whether Taiwan recognizes this and is able to develop an alternative strategy approach that will be far more sustainable and also provide the space for it to actually address the kinds of reforms that are required to its procurement, to its military reserves and training, to also prepare for these really high-end scenarios. So a more sustainable path forward. And I think the reserves in particular, I'll just say, are going to be really important to watch to see if they can really turn that around and make that a more successful, that we can get people that want to serve, right? that are willing to defend Taiwan, and that they're actually able to receive the kind of training that they need.
Thank you so much. So we're past time. This is a massive and complicated topic that we could probably talk about all day, but we will have to cut off here. Kelly and James, thank you so much for joining me today, for offering so many really important and enriching insights for this discussion. And to our audience, thank you so much for tuning in, for sending in your questions. And please also sign up for our emails that you receive our new analysis on Taiwan as it's released. And thank you so much for continuing to care about Taiwan and US-Taiwan relations. And have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.